Yo! Holy crap, it's been a while since we've been here. Sorry, everybody. We're on chapter 5 of Bergsonism by Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze. And we are on the last chapter, Elan Vital as movement of differentiation. Crazy. Uh, Cody and I were just chatting about how complicated these chapters are and
Uh,
how all nearly cryptic they are. Do you? What are your thoughts on that so far, Cody?
yeah, cryptic is the right word. Cryptic. Yeah. We're not um we aren't against Bergson. It's not like we're not a fan of Bergson. But when it comes to having actually delved into the material, me and you, I'm gonna speak for us now, if that's okay. I'm gonna say that we've maybe tried our best to delve into a single Bergson text across our lifetime, not just not just recently, but across the entire time of being alive. We've only come across Bergson maybe in the last year properly. I know I only have, and
Yeah.
I've only really delved into bits, really small bits of time and free will, bits that you've shared with me of the creative mind, which was really fantastic, and you've written some pieces out of it. But when it comes to knowing Bergson, which is probably something that anyone going into Gilles Deleuze's Bergsonism would probably think about getting themselves prepped with. We just thought, you know what, we've got Jack and we've got Joby, and we are Spinozans is the word I'm going to use. So we don't care what we if we know who Bergson is before we get into the book called Bergsonism, which is apparently super vital to the rest of the work by Deleuze. We're just gonna go for it. We're just gonna stick our podgy fingers in, our sticky fingers, and feel around and see what we can get from it.
Yeah.
Thing is, not a lot is exactly sticking for us. A lot of stuff is just going straight through, in one ear out the other. Just like whenever they start talking about the past, like I really, 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 really want to know what Deleuze is trying to do and what Deleuze is talking about, but I'm hanging on by a thread. I'm hanging on like a booger in the wind. There is not much that I'm clutching to in these pages. Where I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, oh, absolutely. It, I've had moments like that maybe once or twice in each chapter, but never have I read a whole chapter and gone, oh, that made sense. Just not happened. But I'm okay with that. And sorry for chatting so much, but yeah, now that we're at the last chapter, it's a good moment to kind of reflect on what the rest of the text has been like,
Yeah,
and
I
I'm excited for it.
I think we're gonna get there soon in terms of like maybe a deeper understanding. You would think that we would be close. And honestly, I do think that like chapter 1 and 2 have felt relatively cemented for me. I think
Hmm.
where I start to get a little bit confused is the discussions of time, because time is so
Hmm.
abstract yet so real that it's kind of hard to get a real grasp on.
There's a real verbal jugglery, you could say, that happens with the words pure, and present and past, and all this business with the inverted cone, which is why I'm glad that Jack was there for most of it, because he is the mitochondria of this cell. He is the powerhouse, and he steams on through, and we are just in awe. We're just loving every moment of it. We're like Marty McFly on our skateboard, holding on to the back of the vehicle that is Jack as he just glides on, and we're loving every moment of it. And he's able to digest it. He's able to go, oh, so that's a real Bergson moment. That's a real memory and matter. And we'll go, that's cool. That's awesome. It's good that someone here is knows what's going on. Uh, especially when it comes to time.
So if we're lucky, Jack might be able to grace us with his presence today. But I think for now we'll just try to push on. So okay, let's just go for it. Elon Vital as movement of Differentiation. Our problem is now this. By moving from dualism to monism, from the idea of differences in kind to that of levels of expansion and contraction, is Bergson not reintroducing into his philosophy everything that he had once condemned, the differences in degree and intensity that he so strongly criticized in Time and Free Will? Bergson says, in turn, that the past and the present differ in kind, and that the present is only the most contracted level or degree of the past. How can these two positions be reconciled? The problem is no longer that of monism. We have seen how the coexisting degrees of expansion and contraction effectively implied a single time in which even the fluxes were simultaneous. The problem is that of the harmony between the dualism of difference in kind and the monism of degree of expansion, between the two moments of the method or the two beyonds the turn in experience, recognizing that the moment of dualism has not been suppressed at all, but completely retains its sense. The critique of intensity in Time and Free Will is highly ambiguous. It is directed against the very notion of intensive quantity, or merely against the idea of an intensity of psychic states. It is true that intensity is never given in a pure experience. It is not then intensity that gives all the qualities with which we make experience. Hence, matter and memory recognizes intensities, degrees, or vibrations in the qualities that we live as such outside ourselves, and that as such belong to matter. These are numbers enclosed in qualities, intensities, included in duration. Here again, we must speak of a contradiction in Bergsonism, or rather, different moments of the method, with the emphasis sometimes on one, sometimes on another, but all coexisting in a dimension of depth. Bergson begins by criticizing any vision of the world based on differences in degree or intensity. These, in fact, lose sight of the essential point, that is, the articulation of the real or the qualitative differences, the differences in kind. There is a difference in kind between space and duration, matter and memory, present and past, etc. We may discover this difference by dint of decomposing the composites given in experience and going beyond the turn. We discover the differences in kind between two actual tendencies, between two actual directions toward the pure states into which each composite divides. This is the moment of pure dualism, or of the division of the composites. But we can already see that it is not enough to say that the differences in kind is between two tendencies, between two directions, between space and duration, for one of these two directions takes all the differences in kind on itself, and the differences in degree fall away into the other direction, the other tendency. It is duration that includes all the qualitative differences to the point where it is divided as alteration in relation to itself. It is space that only presents differences in degree to the point where it applies as the schema of an indefinite divisibility. Similarly, memory is essentially difference and matter essentially repetition. There is therefore no longer any difference in kind between two tendencies, but a difference between the differences in kind that correspond to one tendency and the differences in degree that refer back to the other tendency. That is the moment of neutralized, balanced dualism. 3. Duration. memory, or spirit is difference in kind in itself and for itself. And space or matter is difference in degree outside itself and for us. Therefore, between the two, there are all differences of degree, or rather, the whole nature of difference. Duration is only the most contracted degree of matter. Matter is the most expanded degree of duration. But duration is like a naturing nature, and matter is a natured nature. Differences in degree are the lowest degree of difference. Differences in kind are the highest nature of difference. There is no longer any dualism between nature and degrees. All the degrees coexist on a single nature that is expressed on the one hand in differences in kind and in the other differences in degree. This is the moment of monism. All the degrees coexist in a single time, which is nature in itself. There is no contradiction between this monism and dualism as moments of the method, for the duality was valid between actual tendencies, between actual directions leading beyond the first turn experience. But the unity occurs at a second turn. The coexistence of all the degrees, of all the levels is virtual, only virtual. The point of unification is itself virtual. The point is not without similarity to the one whole of the Platonists. All the levels of expansion and contraction coexist in a single time and form a totality, but this whole, this one, are pure virtuality. This whole has parts, this one has a number, but only potentially. This is why Bergson is not contradicting himself when he speaks of different intensities or degrees in a virtual coexistence, a single time, a simple totality. Beautiful. So, should we take a second to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to murmur for a second. Is there anything you wanted to say first?
Uh, I think this is honestly surprisingly clear. I think we can totally see the progression
Mm-hmm.
of Deleuze's entire argument on Bergsonism here, right? Because we start with the different types of problems, right? And we can really start to understand the true kind of problems by looking towards differences in kind as opposed to degree. So that the differences in degree, right, that's kind of the realm of positive atomist science, at least throughout history. It would be atomist science, and then later we would have, like, it seems like a move towards quantum science and probability as opposed to just a simple, like, discrete kind of changes in mechanism, right? But with that being said, right, you can see how, like, Deleuze doesn't subordinate one to the other here, and I think he takes that from Bergson, who's usually read as a pure vitalist, but I think this is like I think this is a mistake and almost a deliberate smear campaign against Bergson, right? I think it was there were some scholars around his time that would try to paint Bergson in this kind of anti-science light, when in fact, if you, like, really just read even one of his books, he makes a lot of explicit points to, like, say that positive science is the main way that we can understand physical matter, and doesn't cast any doubt on that. He just wants to add a metaphysical dimension that can be read alongside it, but as a unitary whole, right? So basically what Deleuze is getting at here, right, is like, we aren't subordinating one to the other, right? We're just we're through this kind of method of, or understanding of time as a single totality, right? We can see how this is simply just a blurred composite right? Does that make sense?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so we might not be fully comprehensible in Bergson per se, but we definitely know when we're coming across Deleuze. We definitely understand Deleuze as a thinker, and it's definitely what we're seeing here. What we understand is we just call it, after reading ATP, pluralism equals monism,
Right.
right? For us, we don't subordinate one to the other. But in the same vein here, we're getting into dualism because this whole text as such kind of responds to Descartes and Kant, and that's what Deleuze is using Bergson for. He's not only dealing with a contradiction he sees in Bergson, but the whole point he's doing it now is that he believes that Deleuze, I'm saying here, has dragged out this Bergsonian contradiction himself throughout the text and hasn't yet ratified it. It's almost like this text has kind of created, first of all, concepts which are there to solve Bergsonian problems. But now we are finding that those concepts are themselves problems to be dealt with. For instance, one of the things we did understand almost immediately, although we've only really tepid with difference and repetition, Deleuze's original philosophical text, we understand the difference itself between difference in degree and difference in kind. Like that's something that's really baseline and very important for us when it comes to distinguishing difference. The contradiction in these concepts is that for us, difference is a monism. We are Spinozists, and we love and we've already appreciated the Spinozan um, history and the Spinozan philosophy of Deleuze. And for us, that means everything to do with monism. And ATP has introduced to us this idea of a monist pluralism, which means that we can both conceive of the one whole of the Platonists and at the same time different, what we call planes. And this is what I believe will come after, thanks to the work that's been done in Bergsonism. But the contradiction is, isn't this a dualist concept then, difference in kind and difference in degree? And that's what we're getting here. Deleuze is saying, of course it's a dualist concept, right? I'm making a mutual exclusion. It's not just in, like you said, you've got the monism of ancient materialism, and then of course you have later developments that then introduce dualism. I think you went to go and say with like quantum stuff like that, but you see it in Descartes. Descartes is a classic for us dualist who finds a difference in kind between mind and body. And our Spinozan critique, the monist critique, is to view mind and body not only as differences in kind, but also as differences of degree, which means we would then subordinate mind and body to something else. But we don't do that. We don't subordinate. We instead see mind and body on the same plane, which we would call the plane of nature as such. And this is the really, I'll stop here. This is the really cool thing, is the very fact that what we're now seeing is after we deal with this, after we deal with how Spinoza deals with what we would call dualistic contradiction, how Deleuze is using these figures, and especially Bergson to deal with contradiction. This point that you brought up, which is important to us, that we are not subordinating. We are not saying dualism is lesser than monism. We are not saying that pluralism is superior. We don't work like that. That's the way what we would call Hegelian dialectics works. It's when you find difference in contradiction and you sublate, which means you subordinate one contradiction to the other. Typically, you look to find a kind of, and this is a really base way of explaining it, a higher synthesis, an elevated form, which unites the two principles which have been created by the contradiction, and then out of that emerges a single one whole concept. For us, we don't disagree with that as such, but we wonder if that model is indeed a model which subordinates difference only to contradiction. What Deleuze would present instead of this Hegelian method is precisely what we get directly from Bergsonism, the virtual and the actual, which allows us to speak of contradiction, not just in terms of subordination. If we look at the contradictions in dualism, we find that monism is better, so monism is therefore the better sublated concept, blah, blah, blah. None of that. We would rather view them all for their virtual potentialities. What can dualism do? That's what we care about. We're pragmatists. What can monism do? Where do they intersect? Where do they cross? And then we also ask, where do they differ? And this happens purely in the virtual. which
Yeah.
is just one of the most fantastic concepts you can get from this. So I'll finish that there, sorry, before I continue to just spiel on and spiel on. But yeah, I really, really liked that. I'm ready to crack on with the rest if you,
Yeah.
unless you have anything to add.
Just
So.
one more comment, because I think what you were saying is spot on. When Deleuze and Bergson's dualism is a monism. Their pluralism is a monism, right? And I think we can see that really clearly
Yeah,
back in the point three. I'm just going to read it one more time. Um, Duration is
yeah.
only the most contracted degree of matter, matter the most expanded degree of duration. But duration is like the naturing nature, and the matter is the natured nature. Differences in degree are the lowest degree of difference. Differences in kind are the highest nature of difference. There is no longer any dualism between nature and degrees. All the degrees coexist on a single nature that is expressed on the one hand in differences in kind and on the other differences in degree. This is the moment of monism. All the degrees coexist in a single time, which is nature in itself. So really, like, what I love about this like short passage, right, is like all of the things that we were kind of keeping separate, right, of like duration from matter and
Hmm.
matter from duration. This becomes totally flatlined in Bergsonism, right? Um, we we could
Absolutely.
still see how they're kind of these different kind of tendencies are totally interpenetrating, right? um
Yeah.
and I also just love that the naturing nature phrasing a lot too. I think it's kind of hard to get at, but naturing nature is a kind of movement, whereas natured nature, which is matter, right, is a kind of law setting movement, right? So like if physical laws, right, would be the natured nature in a sense, because um they are somewhat at least set in stone, or at least like modify what comes in contact with it, whereas the naturing nature is the creative element, which is why it's tied to
Mm.
duration. But regardless, right, we see that like within nature as a whole there's a creative element and a law abiding element, right? So
Yeah.
that's where the difference in repetition I think comes in. I wouldn't completely know off the top of my head because I
Yeah.
still need to read it, but I it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really cool how like even in something like Bergsonism, right, you can start to get like the hints of difference in repetition before even cracking open the
Mm.
text, because like this is something that's totally being prefigured before like before before that even happens, right? You know, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, this is this is the last text before difference and rep, and Jack's been saying as he's been blasting through difference and rep, it's Bergsonism is almost like a preparation for difference and repetition. That's what how it reads to
Yeah.
him. Yeah, the naturing nature is of course pure movement and production, which means that natured nature is more like the product itself, the
Mm-hmm.
product of this production. But of
Exactly.
course, we just like we've been doing here, there is a difference and there is also a similarity. Um, there is absolutely a difference in kinds between pure movement and the products of movement. And at the same time, we are also capable now, thanks to the virtual, of understanding them as two different contractions, as differences of degrees instead of kind. And that would mean that there is movement in objectivity, there
Yes.
is production in the product itself. This is what you've fantastically written on and developed on your essay, the reading report, which delves into the hexaity, which I believe is how Joby told me to say it anyway. And the hexaity is then in a thousand plateaus, so it takes a little while to finally get to this one concept, this one point. It takes another 4 books at least.
Yeah.
And his meeting with Guattari, hexaity, which allows us to, in one concept, blur the line between production, movement, subject, and product, object, thing, you could say, which is what the exa of that word means, whereas the heck means the thisness, right? Yeah, they all blur into one, what we call an event, or like a weather,
Yeah.
where you can't distinguish between where the individuals are and what the entire event is itself. For Deleuze-Guattari, they become one and the same. The entire group collective is its individuals, and its individuals are the movement of the collective, and that's just that's how we use Bergsonism in ATP to read the Guattari for the very political purpose. It's kind of like the politically applied Bergsonism, if you will, which is really funny to think about Bergson as a kind of anarchist Marxist practical manual. It's like Deleuze finding all these Bergsonist concepts only to kind of reinforce his political philosophy. Like how to be a more effective Marxist today, we need Bergson, which is, I think, a hilarious notion, but totally, totally true, especially if you are a Deleuze like us. I'm ready to crack on, sorry.
No, that's
Chatting
I
on.
love it. I love it. So I'm also down to crack on though. So on to page 94. A
Mm.
philosophy like this answers that the notion of the virtual stops being vague and indeterminate. In itself, it needs to have the highest degree of precision. This condition is only fulfilled if, starting from monism, we're able to rediscover dualism and account for it on a new plane. The fourth moment must be added to the three preceding ones, that of dualism recovered, matter, and, in a sense, generated. What does Bergson mean when he talks about elan vital? It is always the case of a virtuality in the process of being actualized, a simplicity in the process of differentiating, a totality in the process of dividing up, proceeding by dissociation and division, by dichotomy, in the essence of life. In the most familiar examples, life is divided into plant and animal. The animal is divided into
Mm-hmm.
instinct and intelligence. And instinct, in turn, divides into directions that are actualized in different species. Intelligence itself has its particular modes or actualizations. It is as if life were merged into the very movement of differentiation in ramified series. Movement is undoubtedly explained by the insertion of duration into matter. Duration is differentiation according to the obstacles it meets in matter, according to the materiality through which it passes, according to the kind of extension that it contracts. But if differentiation does not merely have an external cause, duration is differentiated within itself through an internal explosive force. It is only affirmed and prolonged. It only advances in branching or ramified series. Duration, to be precise, is called life when it appears in this movement. Why is differentiation an actualization? Because it presupposes a unity, a virtual primordial totality that it disassociated according to the lines of differentiation, but that still show its subsisting unity and totality in each line. Thus, when life is divided into plant and animal, when the animal is divided into instinct and intelligence, each side of the division, each ramification, carries the whole with it. From a certain perspective, it is like an accompanying nebulosity, testifying to its undivided origin. And there is a halo of instinct in intelligence, a nebula of intelligence in instinct, a hint of the animate in plants, and the vegetable in animals. Becoming animal, becoming vegetable, right? Differentiation is always the actualization of a virtuality that persists across the diverging lines. Just a little sidebar here is that this is coming directly from creative evolution. So basically, Bergson
Yeah.
attributes this, and we're actually going to see a pretty interesting graph in just a moment that kind of draws this out. But Bergson attributes to plants this, like, I think, carbophonic function, which basically means that plants store solar energy in a really battalion way, where they store the solar energy and the carbon energy within themselves, which kind of gives them this explosive power, whereas animals are seen as just pure expenditure. And of course, right,
Yeah.
any Deleuzian dualism is never quite like just one or the other, right? So basically what he's also saying here is like you're going to always see like some explosiveness within animals as well as expenditure within plants as well. But despite these kind of like maybe impure composites, you still see roughly diverging tendencies, which are themselves different and have differences, but that doesn't mean that one cannot be seen in the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I, sorry, can I quickly, but
Yeah, for sure.
I love this book because we would call that, but we could call it like a Bataillean monism. When he wrote Solar Anus, the kind of whole point of that, and you can read exactly this Bergsonist differentiation between, or at least as we're understanding it, the monism inherent in dualism and the dualism inherent in monism, which is that everything comes back to the sun at the end of the day. All life as such is the excess, the expenditure of the energy, the solar energy produced by the sun, which means that we are totalized, we are united. Heterogeneously would be the term, connected to one as opposed to homogeneous, connected to our own unique origins. We are all connected to the same origin in the same way that the monotheists would use the language of we are all connected by one God, the primer mover, which really influenced Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian medieval theology, which is kind of like we're basically still dealing with the outcome of that, thanks to Nietzsche helping us out with that.
Right.
But basically, absolutely, there is this, there is the one, the platonic whole, the unity. Everything goes back to the sun, and yet at the same time, there is a plurification. There is an absolute multiplicity of differences that are all different to each other, but that all go back to the same origin. I'm stopped.
No, you're good. I think that's a perfect connection to be making. Let's keep going though, because we're really close to finishing up this book. Okay.
Yeah.
We then encounter a problem that is peculiar in Bergsonism. There are two types of divisions that must not be confused. According to the first type, we begin with a composite, for example, the space-time mixture or the perception image and recollection image mixture. We divide this composite into two actual diverging lines that are different in kind and that we extend beyond the turn in experience, pure matter and pure duration, or else pure present and pure past. But now we are speaking of a completely different type of division. Our starting point is unity, a simplicity, a virtual totality. This unity is actualized according to divergent lines differing in kind, right? It explains, it develops what it has kept enclosed in a virtual manner. For example, at each instant, pure duration divides in two directions, one of which is the past, the other the present, or else the elan vital at every instant separates into two movements, one of relaxation that descends into matter, the other of tension that ascends into duration. It can be seen that the divergent lines produced in the two types of division coincide and are superimposed, or at least correspond closely to each other. In the second type of division, we rediscover differences in kind, identical or analogous to those that have been determined in the first type. In both cases, a vision of the world is criticized for only taking an account of differences in degree, where more profoundly there are differences in kind, right? The metaphysical question is the differences in kind. The mechanistic kind of crude materialist way is the only accounting for differences in degree. In both cases, a dualism is established between tendencies that differ in kind. But this is not the same state of dualism, not the same division. In the first type, it is a reflexive dualism, which results from the decomposition of an impure composite. It constitutes the first moment of the method. In the second type, it is a genetic dualism, the result of the differentiation of a simple and a pure. It forms the final moment that the method of the method that ultimately rediscovers the starting point of a new plane. Really good here. I really like this a lot, actually. I think really what
Mhm.
Deleuze is getting on a little bit here is like if we start from impurity, right? This is kind of we're starting at the wrong point. But if we start from this kind of
Mhm.
simple and pure singularity, um, then we'll notice how these are just diverging tendencies of this single life. Because Deleuze really, the haxeity, right, is another way of kind of articulating the concept of singularity as opposed to individuation, I think. Um, so,
Oh, I'll let you continue. I'll have to go in a second, so I'll finish. I'll finish with a little point before I let you. Hopefully, someone joins, but if not, you gotta carry this thing on. And I think you'll be able to do really well. I think you'll do fantastic. Sorry to have to leave you so early on into the reading,
it's okay. We can.
but
It's all good.
we'll still have a good time. And we'll watch this back together, and we'll be able to do more of this in the future. Anyway, I'll let you finish. I'll let you continue. Basically, this is what you gain from when you read Leibniz's monadology. You are left with exactly these simple or pure substances, which come to be referred as nomads. But because we read the history of philosophy kind of retroactively, we've already kind of read the Deleuze and Guattari, so we already know their conclusions, where they end up. So it's quite funny reading back the metaphysical history of philosophy influences, because when we read it, we're like trying to understand it on its own. And then when we understand it, we can then process it through the lens that we already have, which is the critical side of it. And we would critique monadology through Spinoza, where we introduce to these simple or pure monads the duration, right? It's kind of Spinoza and Bergson actually kind of have exactly the same concepts. For Spinoza, instead of duration, it's nature naturing, pure movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for Bergson, it would be duration, la durée. The other thing would be, as Bergson calls it, badly analyzed composites, which means we typically refer to things which are simple or pure, but they're actually themselves made up of infinite parts. And this is what Spinoza would call the infinitesimal body, which never can. No, sorry, you can never reach a point where it's no longer divisible. There is no indivisible body. It's divisible until infinity. You just come across more and more smaller bodies, but which nevertheless all come as part of the same whole, the same unified totality.
Yeah.
Oh, who's joined?
My body is quite small.
Joe! Fuck,
Hello.
that's good. You replaced me. 'Cause I've now got to hop off and watch I'm a Celeb. But
Oh,
have fun. Reading
oh,
Bergson.
no worries, no worries. We'll do. Fuck it.
Love you.
Well,
Right. Yeah.
thank you for
Have fun.
being here with me at the first part, Cody. Yeah, just to kind of
Enjoy.
expand off of what Cody's saying a little bit, is this is basically Leibniz's, or what Cody's talking about is really similar to Leibniz's, or Leibniz, whatever, his monadology. So you can kind of see a lot of creeping figures in Bergsonism, of like who Deleuze is interested in, what kind of minor philosophers, as opposed to major philosophers that Deleuze is interested in. So Joby, we are basically on right now. We're on page like in the middle of page 96. Just to kind of
I'm just
yeah,
whipping out my own PDF quickly.
for sure. Just to kind of
Uh,
give you some background of what has kind of been talked about so far, um, is we're seeing the classic pluralism equals monism
yeah, if everything's the
approach.
one, then where's the distinction, right? Between everything and it all.
Yeah, exactly. But
Mhm.
then basically, I think what we're seeing is that the differences in degree and differences in kind are always going to be seen in the other, right? They're matter and extension are on a single plane as opposed to being kind of these two completely different things. They can affect each other as opposed to like the monad for Leibniz, which is like there is intensity, but the intensity only has a relative degree of movement within
Mhm.
itself.
Yeah.
But the monad cannot have an effect on extension.
When I think of matter and extension as existing on the same plane, I just simply think of like This might be wrong, but when I think of matter and extension, I think, oh, that's loosely comparable to space and time,
Hmm.
except space and time in classical physics are separated from each other. They are disjointed. They are not touching one another. They must exist in their relatively separate spheres. And it's actually what we're I've spoken about this before, but what we're finding at the moment is the kind of breakdown of space and of time and of the replacement of one for the other. And
Right.
for whatever reason this is, we don't know, but we can link this towards technological invention where we find a way to cheat one for the other. Think about like instant meals, think about freezers, preservation technologies, think about faster and faster jet engines on warplanes, Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. Getting to a place in twice the time, sorry, getting to a place in half the time, twice as fast. It's all, we can trade one distance for a saving of time here and or whatever. But it's the breakdown of these two relatively separate spheres, which is why we're starting, I think, to see a lot more philosophies which are like, fuck it. If we're actually seeing in material reality before our eyes the breakdown of these two spheres, then then is it more accurate to take on a philosophy which looks at matter and extension as existing on the same plane, as opposed to these separate spheres that classical physics has kind of told us they exist on, and we've never experienced in this way because we are always experiencing um, both space and time at the same time. There isn't a separation for us in our experience.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wish like Jack was here because I think he might be able to speak on how this relates to quantum physics because it seems that like the transition from uh classical physics to quantum physics, right? There seems to be
Mm.
that breakdown happening
Yes, absolutely.
basically
We
from
see
yeah.
Yeah, we see entirely new rules the closer we look at the world. Yeah, like again, everything seems to kind of even it's crazy that even the materialist physicists and the materialist the hard science, the hard sciences as you want to call them, even they're like, well, we can't refute the fact that quantum physics exists and it fucks up everything that we've ever thought and held dear. So
Yeah.
yeah, guess we're quirked up now. Or quarked up.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like the classic science. I no, you know what? I'm not going to go on that tangent, but I was going to just go into maybe the state science versus nomad science distinction. But I think then we'll be getting too much in the weeds when.
I didn't plan on coming in and just immediately derailing the meeting.
No, you're good. I think it's all great discussion because honestly, I think chapter 5 I think is where everything really comes together. I mean, as it should. It's the fucking conclusion, but
Yeah.
but it's great. It's um I think
The one chapter I've
yeah,
not read actually.
you should like we're about halfway through it, so you'll get a good amount of it and I have given you a little bit of a breakdown, but whenever you get a chance, definitely just
Yeah,
reread the first half. It's super good.
my own time, yeah. I think there's about 4 or 5 pages you're in.
Yeah, not super far.
Mm.
We're on 96. I think it starts on 91. But are you
You
yeah.
paragraph break in 96. The
Um
one question becomes pressing.
yep, that's where we're at.
Sick.
Cool. I'm going to go for it.
Please.
One question becomes pressing. What is the nature of this one and simple virtual? How is that as early as time and free will, then in matter of memory, Bergson's philosophy should have attributed such importance to the idea of virtuality at the very moment when it was challenging the category of possibility? It is because the virtual can be distinguished from the possible, and from at least 2 points of view. From a certain point of view, in fact, the possible is the opposite of the real. It is opposed to the real. In quite a different opposition, the virtual is opposed to the actual. We must take this terminology seriously. The possible has no reality, although it may have an actuality. Conversely, the virtual is not actual, but as such possesses a reality. Here again, Proust's formula best defines the states of virtuality: real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. On the other hand, Or, from another point of view, the possible is that which is realized, or is not realized. Now the process of realization is subject to two essential rules, one of resemblance and another to limitation. For the real is supposed to be in the image of the possible that it realizes. It simply has existence or reality added to it, which is translated by saying that from a point of view of the concept, there is no difference between the possible and the real. And every possible is not realized. Realization involves a limitation by which some possibles are supposed to be repulsed or thwarted, while others pass into the real. The virtual, on the other hand, does not have to be realized, but rather actualized, and the rules of actualization are not those of resemblance or limitation, but those of difference or divergence and of creation. When certain biologists invoke a notion of organic virtuality or potentiality, and then nonetheless maintain this potentiality is actualized by simple limitation of its global capacity, they clearly fall into a confusion of the virtual and the possible. For in order to be actualized, the virtual cannot proceed by elimination or limitation, but must create its own lines of actualization. I literally just lost my place somehow. Where the fuck? But must create its own lines of actualization in positive X. The reason for this is simple. When the real is in the image and likeliness of the possible that it realizes, the actual, on the other hand, does not resemble the virtuality that it embodies. It is difference, and that is primary in the process of actualization, the difference between the virtual from which we begin and the actuals that which we arrive, and also the differences between the complementary lines according to which actualization takes place. In short, the characteristic of the virtuality is to exist in such a way that it is actualized by very differentiated and is forced to differentiate itself to create its lines of differentiation in order to be actualized. Sheesh.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Why does Bergson challenge the notion of the possible in favor of that of the virtual? It is precisely because, by virtue of these preceding characteristics, the possible is a false notion, the source of false problems. The real is supposed to resemble it. That is to say, we give ourselves a real that is ready-made, preformed, pre-existent to itself, and that will pass into existence according to an order of successive limitations. Everything is already completely given. All of the real is in image, and the pseudo-actuality of the possible. Then the sleight of hand becomes obvious. If the real is said to resemble the possible, is this not in fact because the real was expected to come about by its own means, to project backwards a fictitious image of it, and to claim that it was possible at any time before it happened? In fact, it is not the real that resembles the possible, it is the possible that resembles the real, because it has been abstracted from the real once made, arbitrarily extracted from the real life like a sterile double. Hence, we no longer understand anything either of the mechanism of difference or the mechanism of creation. Boom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about this, or should I?
I do. So I think, but I'm happy to either bounce off of you or to. I'll just go for it really quick. So.
Oh, yeah.
So I think what Deleuze is getting on about here is, if we're only talking about the realization of the possible, or is it the realization of the actual, the realization of the possible, right? We're starting from this point of ready-made like everything is already kind of determined, right? We're starting at
Yeah.
mechanism and determinism,
Mhm.
which is the line of argumentation you'll commonly hear, like the so-called hard determinists. So they're so hard determinist, right?
Mhm.
That can't really understand a concept of free will because everything is already given.
Mm.
There's a chain of everything that's going to happen, and that was already kind of determined from the start. Um,
Yeah, it's a weird. It's a behavioral determinism that is not that distinct from a what's it called in religion, where everything's predetermined,
yeah,
predestination or something like
predestination. Yeah,
that.
God already laid
It's
out the
not.
pieces for us.
Yeah, behavioral determinism is a very similar, not too dissimilar from that sort of religious phenomena where it's like, well, no matter what I do, I was destined to do it anyway.
Hmm.
But behavioral determinists are very similar, where they say, well, let's say that we could understand every single element in an environment. Then
Yeah,
we have an animal that's experiencing like genetic evolution. We should be able to predetermine what that animal will become, what the stresses in that environment will be on the animal,
right.
how it will evolve. Fuck it, if we know that, then we might as well know how that animal will behave to certain stimuli.
Yeah,
And then at that point, we're just kind of getting down to a weird backwards projection where it's like this animal is only. I mean, in this conversation right now, obviously we're talking abstractly, but even to the behavioral determinist, um, um, them they wouldn't even need to like run the gauntlet. They wouldn't need to run the experiment, right? Because they'd already in their mind already understand that everything that they're talking about in the possible is already possibly actual. Like it's already possibly actual. I don't need to run the experiment. It's already actual essentially.
yeah.
And this is the difference between the, at least in my very vague understanding of this, that seems to be the difference between the possible and the virtual.
Yeah,
Whereas the virtual is not concerned with what passes into the actual or otherwise, right? Because it's still virtual, even if otherwise, it doesn't need to pass into the real to be,
yeah,
you know, considered no longer virtual. Whereas the possible is only possible if it can pass into the real. It seems, at least.
yeah,
Which is also why there's that Gordian knot where you can't quite get rid of the real from the possible. The real must always precede the possible, meaning there isn't really anything outside of the real that you can bring into nothing's possible if it doesn't already pre-exist in the real. And that's why you don't get creative evolution. That's why you can't get creative expression within purely just the possible. It seems that you need a kind of virtual. It seems that you need to kind of go beyond the real in whatever that means, in order to kind of get outside of everything that's already completely given. You don't want a pseudo actuality of the possible. You want an actual actuality. And that's kind of what this, at the very least, from the fucking doozy we just got, those couple pages, I think that's a very little. It's really hard sometimes when they're using a lot of the grammar, where it's like, oh, we have these specific terms, virtual, possible, actual, real, and they could mean anything,
yeah,
So it's hard to sometimes play the game and use the words as intended. But at the very least, like, I think
yeah,
it seems like obviously there are some important words which are important to like distinguish and delimit, and it seems like we're if we had two buckets, one that's cringe and one that's based. I think virtuality is in the based bucket so far, and everything else is to be determined.
well, virtuality to me is just a zone of indetermination, right? So we're if we're looking at this is just hugely a critique of a mechanism in all forms, right? Because the solution that like um a lot of theologians made, and Cody brought up this point too, to the problem of free will, right? Like understanding, like, or trying to get a from mechanism to still having a form of free will. Um,
Mhm.
the way they try to get to this is by introducing the mind as a concept, right? So they erect a dualism and say, well, okay, the material world, that is completely determined, but this other thing, the mind or like intention, there's a lot of ways that this is like kind of said, we can get around this, right, if we have this kind of zone of creativity or indetermination. But they don't always quite do it correctly. They don't. They're close, but they're not quite there.
I get you.
Whereas I think instead of posing it as a problem of free will, I guess Bergson will end up posing this as a problem of free will in his other books, but at least in Creative Evolution, it's more of a problem of creativity, right? And by introducing the virtual as a creative element, where it's not necessarily cause A equals effect B, it's that there's a creativity that happens through that doesn't necessarily cause one or the other, right? There's this virtual kind of zone.
That's what the virtual is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it can't be predetermined. It
Yeah.
just simply can't be. It's like saying God can be predetermined, right? Like there needs to exist this space within which we're not necessarily saying it has to be something brand new, some
Right.
exotic, like some alien material or
Yeah.
anything. We're not saying it has to be, it's like
There's a differentiation
very
though,
similar-
right?
Yeah.
Like in evolution, right? Like we understand that, like, in evolution, right, that whenever like a species has like a kind of small genetic change, that is just its way of kind of expressing its creativity and differentiation. And it's not that like it's completely random and chaotic, but there is an element of creativity within this kind of force of replication, which I think is the whole point of difference and repetition. Sorry, I know I just cut you off, but does that kind of follow up on what you're thinking?
Well, it's like saying mutations can be predetermined.
Right.
No, they're mutations. They are sort of necessarily random to a degree. They aren't and as if all changes, as if all evolution is like we sort of sometimes misperceive evolution as one sort of constant march forward, but actually no, evolution can sometimes be detrimental, right? Genetic mutations can be, they're exactly that. They're mutations. They're not always beneficial, but it still doesn't mean that we should apply like an ethical valence to it. We're not saying, oh, this look at this look at this bird that evolved pink feathers and got like absolutely blasted by a predator. That's not creative evolution. That's just poor design or something. No, it's still it's still creative expression, my man.
You know what's funny?
Okay.
Is we brought up evolution, and the next fucking line is about evolution. So I think we're about to have the point retroactively proven for us. But
I did notice that.
Okay, cool. So let's keep going though. Evolution takes place from the virtual to actuals, right? What we just said. Evolution is actualization. Actualization is creation. When we speak of biological or living evolution, we must therefore avoid two misconceptions: that of interpreting it in terms of the possible that is realized, or else interpreting it in terms of pure actuals. The first misconception obviously appears in preformism. And contrary to preformism, evolution will always have the merit of reminding us that life is production, creation of differences. The whole problem is that of the nature and the causes of these differences. The vital differences or variations can certainly be conceived of as purely accidental, but three objections to an interpretation of this kind arise. 1. Since they are due to chance, these variations, however small they are, would remain external, indifferent to each other. 2. Since they are external, we could not logically enter into anything but relations of association and addition with one another. 3. Since they are indifferent, they could not even have the means to enter into such relations, for there would be no reason why the small successive variations should link up and add together in the same direction, nor any reason for sudden and simultaneous variation to be coordinated into a livable whole.
I think what they're saying is when certain animals evolved like down certain tracks, for example, I think uh, all mammals stem from the same like genetic ancestor. So whales are related to dogs, are related to humans. Um, but to say that, oh yeah, this is a logical fucking step is like absurd, right? Because like if it was logical, then why can't children pick up on it? You know, if why do we need to be taught about this link? Why is it not obvious? Um, but it isn't obvious because it's I'm not saying it's random. I'm just saying it's somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah.
These they're all these variations of you know animals. Like we said, we see evolution as like one constant march forward, when it really isn't. It's not going in one direction. It's just going.
It's going in
Um,
directions, right? Like, so in creative evolution, what Bergson says is there isn't a telos to nature, right? There isn't going to be a point where we say that evolution is complete. But
Evolution 2, baby.
yeah, he instead substitutes this idea with an original impetus, right? There was just an original kind of like Big Bang kind of thing where like an explosive power kind of fueled life in multiple directions. He says two diverging tendencies or two multiplicities, but even these two multiplicities keep getting branched out and divided. And we'll actually see a really good graph of this coming up pretty soon. But yeah, but I think exactly what you're saying is completely right. Right, like nature doesn't have a telos. It isn't linear. It is just moving. It's even to say constant march forward, right? As you said, like the problem with that logic is that it would say that there there is a forward, but really it's just a movement in general. It's not non-teleological. It's
Absolutely.
and that's why evolution can fail. Right, that's why an evolution or mutation, right, can actually kill the animal, or it could make them less adapted to their environment, right?
Yeah.
um,
Well,
um,
sometimes when we know when the environment itself changes, um, we see. I think we've seen. There's the example that a lot of people bring up of the moths
mhm.
during the Industrial uh, Revolution. I believe it was in London, perhaps, where these moths that used to be brown took on darker black. Uh, they took on darker black colors because within generations because they could hide on the
Yep.
tree on the trees easier.
Yeah.
But like nobody would have called the moth before the environment changed imperfect. They'd be like, oh, it's like apex form or whatever. But then the environment suddenly changes and it's no longer apex form. That's not the fucking moth's fault.
Yeah. And
you know?
what we get to is a kind of indeterminism, which is based just on variations and differentiation and external relations, right? Like the plane of immanence is purely external, but also intensive, and that's the flatlining that we get. It's
Yeah,
super cool.
completely.
Cool. Let's keep going. I really want because I want to get to this graph because it's freaking dope. It honestly helps explain a lot of it.
Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Sure. So we just finished that third point, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to scroll down?
Yeah, so I think you're on.
I think you need to scroll down a little bit on your page.
Yeah, so if we invoke.
There we go.
Yeah.
If we invoke the action of the environment and the influence of external conditions, the three objections persist in another form. For the differences are still interpreted from the perspective of a purely external causality. In their nature, they would only be passive effects, elements that could be abstractly combined or added together. In their relationships, they would, however, be incapable of functioning as a block, so as to control or utilize their causes. The mistake of evolutionism is, thus, to conceive of vital variations as so many actual determinations that should then combine on a single line. The three requirements of a philosophy of life are as follows. 1. The vital difference can only be experienced and thought of as internal difference, It is only in this sense that the tendency to change is not accidental, and that the variations themselves find an internal cause in that tendency. 2. These variations do not enter into relationships of association and addition, but on the contrary, they enter into relationships of dissociation or division. 3. They therefore involve virtuality that is actualized according to the lines of divergence, so that evolution does not move from one actual term to another actual term in homogeneous unilinear series, but from a virtual term to the heterogeneous terms that actualize it along a ramified series. But this leads to the question of how the simple, or the one, the original identity, has the power to be differentiated. The answer is already contained in matter and memory, and the linkage between creative evolution and matter and memory is perfectly rigorous. We know that the virtual as virtual has a reality. This reality, extended to the whole universe, consists in all the coexisting degrees of expansion, détente, and contraction. A gigantic memory, a universal cone in which everything coexists with itself, except for the differences of level. On each of these levels, there are some outstanding points, which are like remarkable points peculiar to it. All these levels or degrees and all these points are themselves virtual. They belong to a single time. They coexist in a unity. They are enclosed in a simplicity. They form the potential parts of a whole that is itself virtual. They are the reality of this virtual. This was the sense of the theory of virtual multiplicities that inspired Bergsonism from the start. When the virtuality is actualized, it's differentiated, it is developed. When it actualizes and develops its parts, it does so according to lines that are divergent, but each of which corresponds to a particular degree in the virtual totality. There is here no longer any coexisting whole. There are merely lines of actualization, some successive, others simultaneous, but each representing an actualization of the whole in one direction and not combining it with other lines or other directions. Nevertheless, each of these lines corresponds to one of these degrees that all coexist in the virtual. It actualizes its level while separating it from the others. It embodies its prominent points while being unaware of everything that happens on other levels. We must think of it as follows. When duration is divided into matter and life, then life into plant and animal, different levels of contraction, which only coexist insofar as they remain virtual, are actualized. And when the animal instinct is itself divided into various instincts, or when a particular instinct is itself divided according to species, levels are again separated, or actually cut out in the region of the animal or of the genus. But however strictly the lines of actualization correspond to the levels or the virtual degrees of expansion, détente, or contraction, it should not be thought that the lines of actualization confine themselves to tracing these levels of degrees, to reproducing them by simple resemblance. For what coexisted in the virtual ceases to coexist in the actual, and is distributed in lines or parts that cannot be summed up, each one retaining the whole, except from a certain perspective, from a certain point of view. These lines of differentiation are therefore truly creative. They only actualize by inventing. They create in these conditions the physical, vital, or psychical representative of the ontological level that they embody. I can continue,
Yeah, that's cool.
unless you wanted to say anything.
Nothing currently. We're
Okay.
going to get to that graph in a second, so we should probably pause there just for a second. But once we get there, that's cool.
How about the paragraph breaks just after the graph? So I will go down to the paragraph break. So it'll be like a little couple sentences after the graph, and then we can go back to the graph if you'd like.
Sounds good.
Okay. If we concentrate only on the actuals that conclude each line, we establish relationships between them. whether of gradation or opposition. Between plant and animal, for example, between animal and man, we now only see differences in degree. Or we will situate a fundamental opposition in each of them. We will see one in the negative of the other, the inversion of the other, or the obstacle that is opposed to the other. Bergson often expresses himself in this way, in terms of contrariety. Matter is presented as the obstacle that the élan vital must get around, and materiality as the inversion of the movement of life. It should not, however, be thought that Bergson's going back to a conception of the negative that he previously condemned, any more than he returns to the theory of deteriorations. One only has to replace the actual terms in the movement that produces them to bring them back to the virtuality actualized in them, in order to see that differentiation is never a negation but a creation, and that difference is never negative but essentially positive and creative.
So good. I love that.
Mm.
So let's just, before we move on, let's just pause and check out this graph a little bit. Cool.
So using Adobe, you can rotate. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we start here from a simplicity, which is the memory duration composite. This composite gets divided in two directions: one of matter and matter and life. So contraction is the intensive movement. Matter is the extensive movement, right? But both of these kind of push into different forms. So matter, the different worlds, and in each world, the types of matter that appear as many external and internal obstacles that life must avoid, right? And life, which is the intentional contraction, the moving inward. There's the chlorophyllic or the chlorophyllus function. This is what I was saying earlier of like the plants. They accumulate energy as a kind of explosive, right? And that is, and they store energy either as a fixation of carbon or a fixation of nitrogen. And animals are the pure expenditure, or they eat the plants or they eat the other animals and they expend this energy exuberantly. That's kind of what the really fun kind of connection to Maty here. And really, these just push into different other directions, which I probably can't get into completely, but let's see. Centralized nervous system, right? So then we start to see kind of a move towards intelligence. This is where we start to see humans. But the human still has all of these, right? You could still kind of see like the line drawn, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a bit of like even plant in the human, right? Because you still have this kind of common ancestor, even if it's a little bit far back. And you see this in evolutionism as well, not just in kind of Bergson's creative evolutionism, but this is why it's a productive movement that's kind of just dividing and differentiating itself as opposed to a negative kind of dialectics. Really cool. Let's see.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we have to rotate left. Cool.
There you go.
Do you want to keep going, or would you like me to pick up?
How about you take this one?
Cool. I think we're getting close to finishing. We always rediscover the laws common to these lines of actualization or of differentiation. There is a correlation between life and matter, between expansion and contraction, which shows the coexistence of their respective degrees in the virtual whole, and their essential relativity in the process of actualization. Each line of life is related to a type of matter that is not merely an external environment, but in terms of which the living being manufactures a body, a form for itself. This is why the living being in relation to matter appears primarily as the stating of a problem, and the capacity to solve problems. The construction of the eye, for instance, is primarily the solution to a problem posed in terms of light. In each type, we will say that the solution was as good as it could have been, given the ways in which the problem was stated and the means that the living being has at its disposal to solve it. It is in this way that, if we compare a similar instinct in various species, we ought not to say that it is more or less complete, more or less perfected, but that it is as perfect as it can be in varying degrees. It is nevertheless clear that each vital solution is not in itself a success. By dividing the animal into arthropods and vertebrates, we have not taken into account the two other directions, echinoderms and mollusks, which are setbacks for the elan vital. Everything takes place as though living beings themselves also stated false problems for themselves in which they risk losing their way. Moreover, if every solution is a relative success in relation to the conditions of the problem or the environment, it is a relative setback in relation to the movement that inverts it. Life as movement alienates itself in its material form that it creates. By actualizing itself, by differentiating itself, it loses contact with the rest of itself. Every species is thus in arrest of movement. It could be said that the living being turns on itself and closes itself. It cannot be otherwise, since the whole is only virtual, dividing itself by being acted out. It cannot assemble the actual part that remains external to the other. The whole is never given, and in the actual and irreducible pluralism reigns, as many worlds as living beings, all closed on themselves. But we must, in another oscillation, be delighted that the whole is not given. This is the constant theme of Bergsonism from the outset. The confusion of space and time, the assimilation of time into space, makes us think that the whole is given, even if only in principle, even if only in the eyes of God. And this is the mistake that is common to mechanism and to finalism. The former assumes that everything is calculable in terms of a state. The latter, that everything is determinable in terms of a program. In any event, time is only there now as a screen that hides the external from us, or that shows how us successively what a god or a superhuman intelligence would see in a single glance. Now this illusion is inevitable as soon as we spatialize time. Indeed, in space, it is sufficient to have dimension supplementary to those where a phenomena happens for the movement in the course of happening to appear to us as a ready-made form. If we consider time as a fourth dimension of space, this fourth dimension will thus be assumed to contain all of the possible forms of the universe as a whole, and movement in space, as well as the flowing in time, will now only be appearances linked to the three dimensions. But the fact that real space has only three dimensions, that time is not a dimension of space, really means this. There is no ethicity, a positivity of time, that is identical to a hesitation of things, and in this way to creation in the world. It is clear that there is a whole of duration, but this whole is virtual. It is actualized according to divergent lines, but these lines do not form a whole on their own account and do not resemble what they actualize. If the choice is between mechanism and finalism is preferable, providing that it is connected in two ways. On the one hand, it is right to compare the living being to the whole of the universe, but it is wrong to interpret this comparison as it is expressed as a kind of analogy between the two closed totalities, macrocosm and microcosm. The finality of the living being exists only insofar as it is essentially open onto a totality that is itself open. finality is external, or it is nothing at all. It is thus the whole classical comparison that takes on another meaning. It is not the whole that closes like an organism. It is the organism that opens onto the whole, like the virtual whole. On the other hand, there is a proof of finality to the extent that we rediscover similar actualizations, identical structures or apparatuses on divergent lines, for example, the eye of the mollusk or the vertebrae. The example will all be the more significant the further the lines are. The more the organ, that is similar, is obtained by dissimilar means. We see here how, in the process of actualization, the very category of resemblance finds itself subordinated to that of divergence, difference, or differentiation. While actual forms or products can resemble each other, the movement of production do not resemble each other, nor the products resemble the virtuality that they embody. This is why actualization, differentiation, are a genuine creation. The whole must create the divergent lines according to which it is actualized and the dissimilar means that it utilizes on each line. There is finality because life does not operate without direction, but there is no goal, because these directions do not pre-exist ready-made and are themselves created along with the act that runs through them. Each line of actualization corresponds to a virtual level, but each time it must invent a figure of this correspondence and create the means of the development of that which was only enveloped in order to distinguish that which was confused.
Okay.
So
I liked
sorry.
yeah, I quite liked those two phrases. I think one of them was finality is external or it's nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also the discussion about um, how time is not merely a fourth dimension of space, but because if it were, it would be the thing that must give appearances to all three dimensions anyway. Um, it's sort of similar to how all of these multiplicities that come from creative evolution are themselves closed systems, but so the whole cannot be given in a closed system, but but yeah, like I like that idea about yeah, I think the whole Kantian conception of like the Ding an sich of like the fourfold manifest of like time and space. This idea of applying spatiality to time and vice versa. Um, obviously it doesn't tell us everything. And yeah, I quite like I can't really comment much more on what we read in any particular way. I just think it's fascinating.
I think I might have one more point, but I'm also happy to move on. Um,
I would actually have to go afterwards if that's okay.
that's okay. That's okay. I
yeah.
might even pause it here because we do have a good amount left, and
Yeah, there's enough to do another reading session if you'd like to.
yeah, I think let's do that. So let's
Oh.
just close off maybe really quick then.
Can you give your final point first?
Yeah. So that was that last part was very challenging, I'll be honest, but I think the part that I'm not going to stick on is the fourth dimension of time stuff. But
No worries.
I think this kind of just all connects back to what we were saying about how Bergsonism is anti-teleological, right? But even that being said, a point that Deleuze is making is that although there is not a final kind of or an end goal, that doesn't necessarily mean there's not finality in a sense. So with nature kind of working in terms of problems and solutions, so nature kind of moving by a kind of problematic, we can kind of start to explain why two different species can come up with two very similar solutions despite not having a common ancestry. So like the eye is a very common example that Bergson uses, and I think the reason why he uses it is because the eye is a very complex thing that like you would not think would happen on accident, right? And that's why the eye is usually posed as this kind of theological point, because only God could really, at least in the theological point of view, right? Only God could make something so crazy complex and that wouldn't even seem doable from this kind of mechanistic like approach, right? Like God is, it's so complex, only God could do it, basically. But if we're looking at nature in terms of problems and solutions, right? Matter is actually self actualizing itself in terms of problems. So the problem is light, right? And how do we respond to light? Well, we respond to light by matter itself, in itself and for itself, creating the solution to the problem of light, which comes in the form of eyeballs and the connection of eyeballs to like synapses in the brain that can create this kind of sense of image for living beings that have eyes. And so it's matter is self-moving is the point, right? So I think if we're looking at it in terms of ancient materialism, right, it's not, we're not here in atomism anymore, right? We're kind of in Lucretius territory of the swerve, and I can't articulate that point too deeply, but basically, as opposed to being kind of determinate, right, it's matter as self-caused. It's the matter itself, not by a prime mover, but itself being the cause of itself. Just
No, no, that's a wonderful way of putting it, actually. The uh yeah, we see these two things in opposition, the sort of body, the body that grows up in an environment, but the body itself is its own kind of environment,
mhm.
and it's sort of a